Imagine a being born of hellfire and vengeance, appearing in the darkest corners of the galaxy, where even the mightiest space marines fear to tread. Spawn has entered the Warhammer 40K Warzone, and nothing, not Chaos, not Daemons, not the Imperium itself, will ever be the same. Every battlefield he steps onto trembles with the whispers of doom. Every enemy feels the weight of inevitable destruction. But is he a savior or a predator? Will his wrath turn the tide of war, or will it consume everything in its path? Witness the clash of hellish power against the most brutal forces of the 41st Millennium, and prepare for a darkness you cannot escape. Spawn's arrival in the Warhammer 40K galaxy was not heralded by fanfare or warning, but by the violent tearing of reality itself. The warp, already a turbulent sea of psychic energy, shuddered as a rift opened in the void above a desolate battlefield. The ground below scorched and shattered from centuries of war. From this chaotic opening, a figure emerged, suspended between realms, his cape unfurling like living shadow, and chains clanking with ominous resonance. The air shimmered with necroplasmic energy, a sickly green aura that pulsed and twisted, reflecting off the jagged ruins of a once proud Imperial fortress, now half sunken into the ground. Even the demons that prowled the edges of reality paused, sensing the arrival of a being whose power rivaled their own. The presence of Spawn was a disruption, a force that neither the Imperium nor the followers of Chaos had ever recorded in their annals, an enigma wrapped in fire and shadow, and yet undeniably real. Sparks of arcane energy crackled across his body, illuminating the intricate designs etched into his armor and the scars of his long, tortured existence, each marking a battle fought in realms both infernal and mortal. The very warp around him seemed to recoil, folding and twisting in unnatural ways as though it recognized him, or perhaps feared him. A surge of raw, malevolent energy erupted from the rift, carrying whispers that clawed at the minds of any psyker nearby. And yet, Spawn remained untouched, his form a stark contrast of defined purpose against the chaotic maelstrom. As he stepped fully into the material realm, the ground beneath his feet burned with the residue of his arrival, and the air shimmered with the lingering scent of brimstone and ozone. Observers, if any dared to watch, would have noticed the peculiar duality of his presence. Part human, part infernal, a warrior forged through death and rebirth, his eyes glowing with the cold fire of a soul that had seen hell and returned. The shadows he cast moved independently, reaching out to touch the ruins and the bodies strewn across the battlefield, almost as if assessing the state of this new war-torn world. From the distance, the low growls of demonic creatures echoed, yet none dared approach, for the sense of power radiating from Spawn was not merely physical, but metaphysical, resonating with the warp itself, challenging the authority of any who had claimed dominion over it. Spawn's chains rattled with deliberate cadence, swinging and lashing at invisible threats, as if he could perceive enemies beyond mortal vision, the energy coiling around them like serpents of living metal. His presence caused fissures to appear in the very fabric of reality, tiny windows to other dimensions that flickered open and closed in rapid succession, revealing glimpses of landscapes both horrifying and magnificent. The battlefield, long, desolate, and marked by the scars of unending conflict, now felt alive with potential, charged by his energy. Even the remnants of Imperial technology nearby seemed to react, power conduits sparking and machinery vibrating as though acknowledging the intrusion of a being beyond conventional comprehension. The necroplasm that emanated from him pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, each surge sending tremors through the air that could be felt by those attuned to the warp. It was not merely his arrival that caused fear, but the sense that he had arrived with purpose, a mission that was inscrutable to mortal minds, yet undeniably immediate. Those who had survived countless wars, who had stared into the void and returned, felt an unspoken dread as they observed Spawn, unsure if he was herald of salvation, vengeance, or annihilation, yet unable to deny the undeniable fact that the universe had grown infinitely larger, infinitely more dangerous with his arrival. The shadows that clung to him were not simple darkness, but living extensions of his will, wrapping and coiling around debris, corpses, and the very architecture of the battlefield. Sparks of necroplasm danced along the edges of his tattered cape, forming momentary shapes that hinted at past lives, old battles, and the infernal forces he had conquered or been enslaved to. The air vibrated with the sound of his chains dragging and striking, a metallic symphony that seemed to mock the silence of death surrounding him as he took his first steps into the ruined expanse. The ground itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, cracks spreading outward, emitting faint green light that pulsed in sync with his energy. Psychers and soldiers alike, hidden in shattered walls or half-collapsed bunkers, could feel it, the subtle tug of reality being rewritten around him, the sense that every action he might take carried consequences far beyond the immediate. This was not a mere warrior entering a battlefield. This was an entity whose existence altered the very rules of engagement, whose arrival shifted the balance between life, death, and the ceaseless hunger of the warp. Even the daemons who prowled the edges of perception recoiled slightly, snarling and retreating, their instincts warning them that this newcomer was unlike any adversary they had faced. The being whose power was not granted by allegiance to chaos, but by a covenant older, darker, and far more personal. A covenant born of pain, vengeance, and the relentless drive to impose his own will upon an uncaring universe. Spawn moved through the shattered ruins with a predator's grace, his chains writhing and snapping in the air, as if seeking unseen prey. The remnants of a Chaos Space Marine patrol rounded a scorched corner, their power armor dented and scorched from recent engagements. Their bolters trained reflexively on the flickering green glow emanating from Spawn's form. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to slow as the hulking warriors assessed the intruder. Recognizing instantly that this was no ordinary foe, Spawn's eyes burned with a hellish intensity, glowing under the shadow of his cowl, and his cape billowed with a life of its own, curling and twisting as though sensing the malice and aggression radiating from the Space Marines. The air around him shimmered with necroplasmic energy, distorting the edges of reality, and the smell of brimstone and ozone filled the battlefield. A stark contrast to the usual acrid scent of promethium and blood. The first Chaos Marine stepped forward, its voice amplified unnaturally through its helmet, a challenge masked with arrogance. Yet even he felt the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor of dread that Spawn's presence imparted. With emotion as fluid as shadow flowing over stone, Spawn swung a chain, the metal links screaming through the air, slicing through the armor plating of the lead Marine before he could even fire a shot. Sparks erupted as necroplasm seared through ceramite, and the other Marine's instincts kicked in, bolters roaring. But each bullet seemed to strike against a force that did not behave like conventional armor. The green energy around Spawn absorbing and deflecting, leaving only scorched marks. The chaos of battle erupted instantaneously, a dance of death punctuated by the hiss of energy, the crack of chains, and the unearthly screams of creatures caught between worlds. As Spawn advanced, the Chaos Marines realized that conventional tactics were failing, that their centuries of training and genetic enhancements were insufficient against a force that defied all known laws of war. The necroplasmic energy radiating from him created distortions, making their movements sluggish and their perception unreliable, shadows stretching unnaturally, hiding threats and revealing vulnerabilities in their own formations. Each step he took left glowing green impressions in the ground, marking the terrain as tainted by his infernal presence, a subtle reminder that every inch of ground he crossed became part of his battlefield. The Marines attempted a coordinated charge, their chainswords revving and their power fists ready. But Spawn's movements were unpredictable, a blend of acrobatic fluidity and raw brute force. He twisted midair, his chains lashing in multiple directions, ensnaring a Marine's arm and yanking him violently into the debris-strewn ground. Necroplasm seared through ceramite and flesh alike, fusing and tearing, leaving nothing recognizable of the warrior, save for a lingering echo of his torment. The remaining Marines hesitated, their training screaming at them to regroup. But Spawn was already upon them, a living nightmare whose presence alone warped their perceptions. He moved like a storm of shadow and flame, striking with precision, yet leaving room for fear to fester. Knowing that every second they survived would only deepen their terror, their uncertainty feeding the power that seemed to radiate from his very being. Spawn's approach was methodical yet chaotic, a paradox mirrored in the reactions of the Chaos Marines. One tried to summon demonic support through his psychic conduits, but the warp itself seemed resistant, quivering in the presence of Spawn's energy. The Daemon's incantation faltered, twisted by the necroplasmic aura, and in that moment, Spawn seized the advantage. Chains flew like serpents, wrapping around limbs, necks, and torsos, yanking, twisting, and tearing with precision that belied any sense of randomness. Each strike carried a psychic weight, a suggestion of despair and pain that burrowed into the minds of his foes, even as their bodies were battered and broken. The battlefield became a blur of motion, green energy, and screaming metal as Spawn wove between attacks, never truly touching the ground fully, his cape and chains forming a living extension of his will. Even the terrain seemed to assist him, rubble and detritus shifting subtly, guiding him toward weak points in the Marines' formation, creating opportunities for devastating strikes. The Chaos Marines' initial arrogance dissolved into confusion, fear, and anger. Their coordinated assault unraveling as they realized that their adversary did not merely fight physically, but attacked the very essence of their being, exploiting weaknesses in thought, perception, and resolve simultaneously. In the chaos of the skirmish, a Space Marine attempted a desperate grappling maneuver, hoping to bring Spawn down with brute strength. But the attempt failed spectacularly. Necroplasm surged from Spawn's body, wrapping the attacker in tendrils of green energy that seared through armor and flesh alike. The screams that followed echoed across the battlefield, reverberating in the ears of the other Marines and striking terror into any who might have been observing from a distance. Spawn did not pause. He was a force of motion, a singularity of violence and control, each attack both brutal and precise. The remaining Marines regrouped hastily, firing bolters with trembling hands. But the rounds ricocheted harmlessly off the necroplasmic shields he unconsciously generated around himself. A barrier that seemed to be part of his very form. Each swing of his chains, each flicker of his cape, sent shockwaves across the battlefield, knocking debris into their faces, blinding and disorienting them further. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was a test of will against a being whose mere presence challenged the fundamental assumptions of reality. Even the air seemed charged with his power, vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on the back of the Marines' necks stand rigid, making every heartbeat thunder painfully in their ears. The Chaos Marines, trained for centuries to fight without fear, to embrace the terror of war and the warp, now found themselves confronting an entity whose power they could not categorize, whose origin defied their understanding of allegiance and threat. Spawn moved as if guided by instinct, intuition, and a deep-seated knowledge of death itself. A predator in the truest sense, his every motion calculated to maximize both effect and dread. Necroplasm splashed across armor, melting helmets and blinding their wearers temporarily, while his chains lashed out with uncanny precision, striking with the force of a battering ram. The battlefield became a symphony of destruction, a chaotic ballet of carnage in which Spawn was both conductor and storm. The few Chaos Marines still standing knew instinctively that conventional tactics would not suffice, that the confrontation was not merely physical, but existential. As they struggled to regroup, to comprehend, Spawn moved closer, a shadow of vengeance and power, an unearthly presence whose motives were inscrutable, yet whose purpose was unmistakable: to dominate, to challenge, and to leave the battlefield irrevocably changed by his touch. The sudden detection of Spawn by the Inquisition sent ripples of alarm through the Imperium, a subtle, insidious tremor that reached the ears of Ordo Malleus and Ordo Hereticus alike. Psychers monitoring the warp reported anomalies unlike anything recorded in Imperial archives. Energy signatures that flickered between life and death, chaos and order, infernal and mortal, a paradox that confounded even the most experienced inquisitors. Inquisition agents convened in shadowed chambers atop spired citadels, their faces grim behind masks of ritualistic anonymity, debating the implications of this new presence. Some argued that Spawn could be an invaluable tool, a weapon forged outside the rigid structures of the Imperium, his hellish abilities potentially turning the tide against demonic incursions or the spreading corruption of chaos worlds. Others, however, feared that his very existence violated the natural order, a being who answered to no master, whose allegiance could not be trusted, whose power threatened to destabilize the fragile balance maintained by the Emperor's vigilant servants. Documents were scrawled in meticulous hand, charts of psychic resonance and warp disturbance compiled with painstaking care, each report concluding in the same unsettling realization: this was no mere interloper, but an entity whose presence demanded attention, observation, and possibly preemptive action. The Inquisition dispatched envoys and covert operatives to survey the battlefield where Spawn had first emerged, their forms cloaked in ritualistic ceramite and shadow, moving silently among ruins and corpses. Observers whispered into vox screens, their voices hushed as they recorded each subtle motion of the newcomer, the faint ripple of necroplasm around his form, and the way the surrounding environment seemed to bend and react to his mere presence. Even the most battle-hardened operatives noted the unnatural aura that hung over him, a blend of menace and authority that transcended mortal comprehension. Their instruments, calibrated to detect psychic distortions and warp anomalies, registered spikes and dips with alarming irregularity, evidence that Spawn operated on a level entirely outside standard parameters. Each report, sent back to Inquisitorial headquarters, painted a picture of a being both terrifying and enigmatic, one whose motives were inscrutable and whose potential for either destruction or salvation was limitless. The higher-ranking Inquisitors debated tirelessly over whether to engage, manipulate, or simply monitor, knowing that any miscalculation could unleash consequences far beyond a single planetary system. Spawn's movements across the battlefield only amplified the urgency of the Inquisition's scrutiny. As he tore through Chaos Space Marines and demonic entities with terrifying efficiency, the observers noted his unique approach to combat. He did not merely kill or destroy. He reshaped the environment, altering the battlefield itself as a reflection of his will. Ruined buildings seemed to shudder as his chains lashed against the ground, debris levitating momentarily before crashing down in controlled chaos, and his necroplasmic energy left lasting marks on the terrain that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. Psychers monitoring from afar reported subtle psychic echoes, whispers that were neither fully malevolent nor wholly benign, a mixture of infernal memories and human recollection that hinted at a tortured past, yet a focused purpose. The Inquisition's agents observed that Spawn's presence influenced the morale of all factions nearby, turning even the most fanatical Chaos troops hesitant, their confidence faltering under the oppressive weight of his aura. Imperial survivors, too, experienced a mixture of awe and fear, perceiving him as both a savior and an omen, a being whose power seemed to transcend the dichotomy of loyalty and heresy, embodying a force that existed beyond the simple definitions of good and evil. Within the chambers of the Inquisition, discussions turned to strategy, the difficult calculus of whether to attempt contact, subjugation, or elimination. Some argued for delicate negotiation, citing that Spawn's animosity toward demonic entities could align with Imperial objectives, a temporary alliance forged from mutual interest. Others cautioned that any interaction was fraught with risk, that Spawn's motivations were shaped by ancient pacts and personal vengeance, forces that could turn against humanity with devastating consequences. The more conservative voices called for containment protocols, deploying specialized teams to track and, if necessary, neutralize the anomaly before it could destabilize entire sectors of the Imperium. Schematics of potential trats, psychic wards, and strike teams were drafted with meticulous precision, each scenario weighed against the likely countermeasures Spawn could employ, from teleportation to necroplasmic strikes, from manipulating shadows to exploiting psychic vulnerabilities. Yet even in these calculations, there was an unsettling acknowledgement that Spawn might be entirely unpredictable, operating outside the constraints of conventional tactics. A force of nature that required a paradigm shift in both strategy and understanding. Reports trickled in from distant worlds where Spawn's passage had left subtle, lingering effects. Entire ecosystems seemed temporarily influenced by his energy, flora and fauna behaving unnaturally, sometimes hostile, sometimes protective, as if the necroplasmic aura rewrote instinctual patterns. Inquisitorial archivists documented these changes meticulously, noting correlations between Spawn's proximity and warp activity spikes, the anomalies, resistant to established models. Some agents even reported visions during meditation, brief glimpses of fiery realms and shadowed landscapes, presences, whispering promises and threats in equal measure, leaving lingering impressions that defied conventional interpretation. These accounts, while unsettling, reinforce the growing realization within the Inquisition that Spawn was more than a mere warrior or anomaly. He was a nexus, a singularity of power whose influence radiated far beyond immediate physical interactions, a being whose existence might fundamentally alter the Inquisition's understanding of the warp, heresy, and the boundaries of life and death. Spawn's interactions with the battlefield and the surrounding forces became the subject of intense scrutiny. Each encounter analyzed for potential patterns or vulnerabilities. Inquisitors debated the implications of his combat style, his ability to manipulate shadows, and the evident intelligence behind every strike. Reports highlighted that while Spawn acted with lethal precision, there were hints of restraint, suggesting an internal code or principle guiding his actions, one that could be exploited if properly understood. Psychic readings indicated that his mind operated on multiple planes simultaneously, processing both immediate threats and the underlying currents of the warp in a manner far superior to conventional psychers. This duality, lethal instinct tempered with intelligence, posed both opportunity and threat to the Imperium. If Spawn could be persuaded, manipulated, or guided, he might serve as a weapon against chaos, a tool of immense destructive capability, wielded with a purpose aligned, however temporarily, to the Emperor's will. Conversely, any misstep could see him turning against Imperial forces, his wrath indiscriminate and devastating, leaving entire systems in ruin. Certain chapters of Space Marines observe Spawn from the periphery, their battle brothers, wary yet intrigued by the sheer destructive power he wielded. The Ultramarines, always cautious and methodical, debated whether this hell-spawned warrior could be an ally or a threat to the Emperor's grand designs, weighing the risks of associating with a being who seemed to straddle the line between mortality and infernal vengeance. Meanwhile, a select group of Raven Guard operatives, masters of stealth and reconnaissance, shadowed Spawn, across desolate war zones, noting the precision of his movements, the intelligence in his strikes, and the almost ritualistic cadence with which his chains lashed through the air. They reported back to their chapter masters, describing him as a force both alien and familiar, a warrior who seemed to share their hatred for demonic corruption, yet operated with a freedom and ruthlessness that no loyalist space marine would dare. For some, the idea of forging an alliance was controversial. Trust was a currency earned through blood and deeds, not mere observation. Yet Spawn's actions against chaos entities demonstrated a singular focus that mirrored the objectives of the Emperor's finest, even if his methods were far more brutal and uncontrolled. The captains of these chapters deliberated privately, their councils illuminated by the faint glow of tactical hololiths, debating the potential benefits and risks of cautiously approaching or even requesting the aid of a being whose power dwarfed conventional expectations. A creature born of vengeance and otherworldly torment, yet capable of striking fear into the heart of daemons and traitors alike. When the opportunity arose, a detachment of Blood Angels approached Spawn on a war-torn battlefield, their armor scorched from previous engagements, their banners tattered, but standing as a symbol of defiance. The squad moved with caution, aware that conventional signals and gestures might be meaningless to a warrior of his nature. Spawn's form emerged from the mist of necroplasm and smoke, his chains clinking softly yet menacingly, the green glow of his aura reflecting off the shattered remains of titanic war machines strewn across the terrain. A tense silence fell, broken only by the distant roar of bolters and the hiss of flamers, as if the very environment recognized the gravity of this encounter. The Blood Angels observed his posture, noting the subtle indicators of awareness and intelligence, and cautiously signaled that they came not as aggressors, but as allies. Their gestures, formal, yet understated, in recognition of a warrior who operated by codes and rules unknown to them, but evidently guiding his every strike. Spawn paused, assessing, his eyes burning with an infernal fire that seemed to peer directly into the intentions of those before him, as though weighing whether their motives were genuine or merely prelude to betrayal. Over time, cautious cooperation developed between Spawn and certain Space Marine squads, particularly in engagements against overwhelming chaos forces. The Emperor's finest noticed that Spawn's abilities complemented their own in extraordinary ways, where bolters and chainswords faltered against demonic entities. Spawn's necroplasm carved through warp-tainted flesh with terrifying precision, leaving enemies reduced to twisted echoes of their former selves. Tactical coordination emerged organically, as if unspoken understanding bridged the gap between human strategy and infernal instinct, allowing Space Marines to anticipate his movements and create opportunities for him to strike with devastating effect. His presence on the battlefield caused a subtle shift in morale, even among veteran Marines. The knowledge that a being capable of annihilating Greater Daemons with a mere swing of chains existed beside them bolstered their resolve, tempered with the ever-present caution that Spawn answered to no oath, only his own judgment. In some ways, he became both weapon and sentinel, a force multiplier whose unpredictability challenged the rigidity of traditional battle doctrine while simultaneously proving its unparalleled effectiveness against the forces of chaos. Yet, the alliance was never without tension. Spawn's methods, often grotesque in their intensity, clashed with the Space Marine's sense of honor and discipline. Where loyalist warriors aimed to subdue, disable, or purify, Spawn struck with lethal finality, his attacks weaving lingering psychic impressions of fear and torment upon survivors and foes alike. Captains and sergeants found themselves struggling to reconcile the immediate tactical advantage of his intervention with the psychological consequences of witnessing his unrestrained infernal power. Discussions in strategy chambers shifted from purely operational concerns to philosophical debates, questioning the morality and implications of aligning, even temporarily, with a being who walked the line between vengeance and savagery. Despite these debates, the effectiveness of Spawn on the battlefield could not be denied. Engagements that would have ended in stalemate or retreat were transformed into decisive victories, with enemy morale shattered before the physical conflict had fully commenced. His presence forced commanders to adapt, to anticipate the ways in which his unpredictability could shape outcomes, and to find ways to leverage his abilities while mitigating the collateral, psychological, and physical damage that accompanied them. Spawn's influence extended beyond immediate combat effectiveness. In the wake of battles where he had fought alongside loyalist Space Marines, rumors and legends spread among Imperial troops and planetary populations. His name became synonymous with a dark savior, a being who arrived in moments of hopelessness to turn the tide with uncanny precision and brutal force. While this inspired some to renewed courage, others regarded him with suspicion, wondering whether a warrior of such power and autonomy could ever be trusted, whether the lingering green glow of necroplasm and the shadow of chains symbolized salvation or judgment. The Space Marines themselves became reluctant storytellers, aware that excessive discussion of their alliance with such a being could draw unwanted attention from the Inquisition or even provoke the envy and ire of other factions who might seek to control or destroy him. Yet within the chaos of war, the practical benefits outweighed the abstract dangers, and chapters willing to embrace his presence did so cautiously, always mindful that any miscalculation could result in catastrophe. Over multiple campaigns, subtle patterns emerged in Spawn's conduct that allowed cautious collaboration to deepen. he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of battlefield psychology, targeting threats that would cause maximum disruption to enemy morale while leaving allies relatively unscathed. His movements were swift and fluid, often anticipating enemy strategies before they were enacted, suggesting a form of intelligence that was both preternatural and honed through centuries of combat experience. Space Marines, observing these engagements, began to adjust their tactics accordingly, creating openings and opportunities that Spawn could exploit with deadly efficiency. The Alliance forming a dynamic interplay between rigid military doctrine and chaotic infernal instinct. This synergy, fragile and temporary though it was, began to redefine the potential of battlefield strategy in the presence of entities whose power transcended conventional comprehension, suggesting that even the Emperor's finest could benefit from cooperation with forces that operated beyond human understanding while remaining vigilant to the dangers inherent in such alliances. Spawn moved into the heart of the warp with a calculated confidence, a realm of twisting reality and screening souls, where even the most seasoned chaos sorcerers tread lightly. The sky, or what passed for sky in this dimension, pulsed with sickly hues of green and violet, tendrils of raw psychic energy lacing through the air like living lightning. Spawn's chains rattled with a low, resonant hum, vibrating in tune with the chaotic rhythms of the warp itself, as though sensing the presence of Greater Daemons drawn to his intrusion. The ground beneath him, warped and uneven, seemed almost alive, reacting to the weight of his intent, shivering underfoot with anticipation. From the distance, massive, grotesque shapes emerged from the swirling mists, the hulking forms of Greater Daemons, manifesting with a predatory awareness, their eyes glowing with malevolent curiosity and disdain. Spawn's aura flared brighter, necroplasmic energy coiling around him in fierce arcs, casting shadows that twisted and writhed independently, lashing at any demonic appendage that ventured too close. He stepped forward, deliberately, chains extending and striking like serpents, tearing through the incorporeal forms of lesser entities that dared to harass him, their screams echoing through the warp in horrifying tones that vibrated in the mind of any who dared witness. The very fabric of the dimension seemed to resist his passage, but he pressed onward, a singular force of vengeance and defiance cutting through the chaos with unnatural precision and fluidity. His form, both spectral and corporeal in the same breath, leaving trails of green fire in his wake. The first confrontation with a Greater Daemon erupted suddenly, a colossal being wreathed in fire and shadow, its limbs twisting impossibly, horns spiraling into the void above, claws the size of tank treads scraping across the warped terrain. Spawn reacted instantly, swinging his chains with a force that shattered reality itself in localized bursts, wrapping them around the daemon's limbs and yanking with brutal efficiency. Necroplasm seared through the demonic flesh, an energy antithetical to its existence, eliciting a scream that resonated through the warp like a crashing cathedral. The daemon lashed back, tendrils of warp energy tearing at Spawn's cloak, yet he moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible. A dancer in the midst of a storm of destruction, his chains whipping in arcs that struck with both precision and devastating impact. Each strike carried more than mere physical force. Spawn's attacks disrupted the daemon's form on a fundamental level, unraveling it temporarily, forcing it to flicker between manifest and immaterial states as it struggled to maintain cohesion against a power it could scarcely comprehend. The clash of energies sent shockwaves across the surrounding warp, displacing psychic currents and creating zones of instability that radiated outward, drawing the attention of other demonic entities who hesitated, sensing a predator unlike any other had entered their domain. As the battle intensified, Spawn adapted, using both environment and instinct to his advantage. Massive chasms of living warp energy opened beneath his foes as he pulled chains taut, yanking greater demons off balance and into their own warped reflections, the landscape itself becoming a weapon under his influence. Necroplasmic blasts radiated from his form, disintegrating spectral barriers and ripping holes in demonic anatomy, while the chains themselves acted almost as extensions of his consciousness, striking with intent that was preternatural in its accuracy. The screams and howls of the daemons mingled with the distorted whispers of the warp, creating a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm any observer's sanity. Yet Spawn moved through it unflinchingly, a figure of resolute vengeance and cold focus. Even the daemons that had grown accustomed to centuries of carnage and manipulation recoiled under the relentless onslaught, their confidence faltering as they realized that this intruder did not merely fight, but dominated the battlefield, bending its energies and shaping events according to his will. The very air shimmered and vibrated around him, as if the warp recognized him not as a mere intruder, but as a force capable of reshaping the rules of existence within its chaotic expanse. Spawn's engagement with successive greater daemons became a brutal ballet, each encounter testing his skill, endurance, and infernal resilience. One massive daemon attempted to ensnare him with tendrils of fire and shadow, coiling like serpents, but Spawn's chains intercepted with lightning reflexes, wrapping and striking, tearing through both physical and psychic defenses. Necroplasm consumed the daemon's form in flashes of green, the residue of his power lingering in the warped air as an aura of disruption that prevented other entities from coalescing nearby. The chaotic energy of the warp reacted violently to his presence, producing localized storms of psychic interference, flickering and splitting. Yet he adapted, his movements both instinctive and deliberate, a fusion of hellish training and battle-hardened awareness honed over countless confrontations. lesser daemons attempted to swarm him in numbers. But the combination of chain strikes, necroplasmic blasts, and strategic use of the environment rendered them ineffective, their forms shredded before they could coalesce into coordinated attacks. Spawn's awareness extended beyond the immediate threats, perceiving shifts in the currents of the warp, sensing the approach of distant entities, and preemptively shaping the battlefield to ensure that he maintained dominance at every turn. Witnessing the battle from the edges of the warp, psychers and other warp-sensitive beings reported phenomena that defied rational explanation. Time seemed to dilate in proximity to Spawn, moments stretching and compressing as his energy warped perception. Echoes of past lives, both human and infernal, flickered in the minds of those attuned to psychic currents, suggesting that Spawn's presence resonated across dimensions and timelines, only shadows melting into darkness, a nexus of energy that carried both vengeance and a singular purpose. Greater Daemons, accustomed to being apex predators in this reality, found themselves struggling against a force that could anticipate, counter, and dismantle their forms and strategies in ways previously thought impossible. The air was thick with the scent of brimstone and ozone, mixed with the intangible weight of infernal power that pressed against the consciousness of any who dared to observe, leaving a lingering impression of awe, terror, and the profound realization that they were witnessing an entity capable of redefining the very nature of conflict in the warp. Spawn's dominance was not solely physical. His presence exerted a psychic influence that subtly undermined the morale and cohesion of his foes. Greater demons that relied on fear and dominance found their control fractured, their own aggression turned inward as they struggled to comprehend a being immune to intimidation, one whose very existence embodied a fusion of human resolve and hellish power. The battlefield became a theater of absolute disruption, with Spawn as both conductor and storm, orchestrating chaos with method and precision. His chains and necroplasm shaped the environment, the combatants, and even the psychic currents of the warp itself, asserting a level of control that challenged centuries of established hierarchy among demonic forces. Each encounter left remnants of energy and destruction that would persist long after his immediate presence, a testimony to the lasting impact of his power and the warning it sent to all who might oppose him in this dimension, signaling that Spawn was a force not to be underestimated, a singularity of vengeance capable of bending even the chaotic expanse of the warp to his will. Spawn's arrival on war-torn Imperial worlds left a profound and unsettling impact on planetary civilizations, his presence rippling through both the physical and psychological landscape in ways that were difficult to quantify. Cities reduced to rubble from centuries of endless conflict seemed to breathe again in his presence, or perhaps It was a tremor of fear and awe that coursed through the surviving inhabitants. Civilians who had spent their lives under the oppressive shadow of constant warfare found themselves staring at the green glow of necroplasm cutting across the sky, a figure wreathed in shadow and fire descending from the heavens like a judgment incarnate. Rumors spread quickly through the ravaged populations. Some whispered of a savior who struck at the forces of chaos with supernatural precision, a being who could erase the horrors that had haunted their world for generations. Others spoke of Spawn as an omen, a harbinger of vengeance, whose arrival heralded devastation as surely as it did deliverance. Children peeked from behind broken walls, eyes wide, witnessing a warrior whose very movements seemed to warp reality. Shadows melting into darkness, chains lashing like serpents, cape billowing as if alive, and the smell of brimstone and ozone lingering in the air like a promise or a curse. Priests and local magistrates struggled to interpret his presence, their sermons fracturing under the weight of uncertainty, unable to reconcile the existence of a being who operated outside the rigid doctrines of the Imperium, yet fought against the same enemies that had plagued their world for decades. As Spawn moved through settlements, the psychological effect on civilians was immediate and visceral. Soldiers tasked with defending ruined strongholds reported heightened morale in the presence of the Hellspawn warrior. His attacks against Chaos Raiders and Daemons inspired courage, yet his methods induced fear. The sight of entire squads of enemies obliterated by necroplasmic chains, leaving both awe and horror in their wake. Spawn did not discriminate between threats and collateral, but his focus on evil and corruption was unmistakable, his judgment swift and merciless. For many inhabitants, the distinction between deliverer and destroyer blurred, creating a mythology around him that spread faster than any official report from the planetary governors. Taverns, marketplaces, and hidden settlements buzzed with speculation, tales growing wilder with each telling, portraying Spawn as both the embodiment of vengeance and the spectral protector of the helpless. Some elders claimed that the green glow of his energy healed the land, or at least purged lingering taint from warp corruption, while others swore that his presence drew attention from darker forces, marking those he touched for consequences they could scarcely anticipate. The Imperium's local authorities found themselves in a precarious position, caught between harnessing the hope Spawn inspired and controlling the fear he spread. Commanders stationed on besieged worlds sought to coordinate their defenses around his interventions, but his unpredictable nature defied conventional military strategy. Spawn operated according to his own moral code, one forged in centuries of torment, vengeance, and infernal paths, only shadows melting into darkness. A code that did not align neatly with the rigid doctrines of the Emperor or the chain of command of planetary governors. Despite this, his ability to neutralize greater threats of chaos left commanders grudgingly dependent on his presence. Entire battle plans were rewritten to accommodate his actions. Infantry units adjusting their movements to support or exploit openings created by his devastating strikes. Artillery redirected to suppress enemies drawn into his wake, and psychers maintaining constant vigilance to anticipate the subtle psychic disruptions emanating from his necroplasmic energy. The synergy, though chaotic, became effective in ways that conventional strategy could not achieve. Yet it required constant attention, coordination, and nerves of steel from those tasked with maintaining order in an already fractured world. Spawn's influence extended beyond immediate military effectiveness. Cultural and religious interpretations of his existence began to emerge organically among the population. Temples and shrines were hastily erected, some venerating him as an avenging spirit sent by the emperor, others offering fearful supplication to avoid drawing his attention, unsure if his intervention would bring salvation or wrath. Legends grew around his past, blending fragments of truth with myth. Tales of a warrior who had died and returned, a being bound by chains of fire and shadow, a guardian of humanity who walked between life and death. The narrative shaped itself quickly. Bards and storytellers wove stories of his battles against demons and traitors, and over time, even soldiers and officials began to internalize these tales. Their perception of him, balancing between practical military utility and the awe-inspiring, almost supernatural presence he projected. The psychological impact was profound. Both hope and terror motivated actions. Civilians and warriors alike, striving to survive, fight, or align themselves with the spectral force that had become central to their understanding of the world's conflict. In territories scarred by warp incursions, Spawn's mere proximity seemed to disrupt lingering corruption, the taint of chaos flickering and burning under the radiant heat of his necroplasmic aura. Reports from Imperial envoys described subtle, almost miraculous effects. Corrupted wildlife recoiling from his presence. Minor demonic disturbances dissipating inexplicably, and psychic currents stabilizing in areas where his energy lingered. Even so, his influence was not uniform, and those who misjudged him or attempted to manipulate him often met with violent repercussions. The chains of vengeance striking with a precision that combined both instinct and intelligence. As such, local populations learned to treat him with a mixture of reverence, fear, and strategic caution, their lives subtly reshaped by the reality of his intervention. Through his campaigns across these planetary civilizations, Spawn became a figure both feared and celebrated, a being whose actions left indelible marks not only on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed them. His interactions shaped the social, military, and spiritual landscapes of the worlds he touched, creating a mythology that blended awe and terror, and altering the way humanity perceived the thin line between salvation and destruction in a galaxy perpetually on the brink of annihilation. Psychic echoes of the Emperor rippled across the Immaterium as Spawn's actions began to leave an undeniable imprint on the galaxy. A disturbance both subtle and profound that caught the attention of the most vigilant minds in the Imperium. From the highest spires of Terra to the distant outposts of remote sectors, the Emperor's presence, faint yet perceptible, seemed to register a being who neither answered to chaos nor served humanity in the conventional sense. Imperial psychers and astropaths reported unusual fluctuations in the Astronomicon, currents of psychic energy bending unpredictably around Spawn's movements, as if the warp itself struggled to reconcile his existence. Those attuned to the Emperor's will felt both curiosity and apprehension. He was a force of immense power, capable of reshaping battles and altering the balance of war, yet entirely autonomous, guided by motives inscrutable to mortals. Councils of the Adeptus Terra convened in secrecy, the highest-ranking officials debating the potential utility and risk of Spawn's presence. Some saw in him a weapon to be observed, guided carefully toward actions that might favor the Imperium's objectives against the ever-present threat of chaos. Others feared that his unpredictable nature and infernal heritage could create consequences too volatile to contain. A disruption not merely to strategic plans, but to the very spiritual and metaphysical order the Emperor had fought to uphold. Spawn's movements across war-torn sectors only intensified these observations. On worlds where he had intervened, his necroplasmic energy left residual traces that interfered with local psychic networks, creating areas of distortion that were difficult for even the most skilled psychers to navigate. These anomalies produced readings that were simultaneously alarming and fascinating, revealing that Spawn's essence did not simply occupy space and matter, but resonated with the Immaterium itself. Inquisitors and astropaths alike debated the significance, noting that while his energy could be harnessed against demonic incursions or heretical uprisings, its very unpredictability meant that observation was as much about caution as it was about potential advantage. The Emperor's psychic awareness, subtle yet constant, seemed to probe the intentions of this hell-spawned warrior, analyzing his actions, weighing his influence on the material and immaterial realms, and considering the long-term implications of allowing such a being to operate unchecked in regions of strategic importance. Even among the most disciplined adepts, there was a growing recognition that Spawn's presence challenged long-held assumptions about power, allegiance, and the thin line between salvation and destruction. The Emperor's subtle attention manifested in indirect ways. Space Marine chapters reported encounters that, while chaotic, seemed to benefit from the manipulation of unseen forces, environmental factors aligning in moments of critical advantage, as if the tide of battle were being subtly guided. Spawn's interventions against demons and traitor forces often coincided with shifts in warp currents, psychic disturbances, or sudden collapses of enemy cohesion that could not be explained by mortal strategy alone. Advisors and astropaths documented these events meticulously, noting correlations between Spawn's actions and shifts in psychic resonance, hypothesizing that the Emperor's will, though inscrutable, may be subtly nudging events to maintain a precarious balance. Yet this interference was neither overt nor guaranteed. Spawn acted according to his own code, his own understanding of vengeance and justice, making him both a potential ally in the fight against chaos and a wild card whose influence could not be fully predicted. Spawn's presence also created a unique tension among Imperial forces, who recognized that his interventions were simultaneously advantageous and disconcerting. Commanders struggled to reconcile the tangible results of his actions with the intangible implications of his existence, questioning whether they were witnessing an instrument of the Emperor's design or a chaotic anomaly whose motives and consequences were unknowable. In many cases, his interventions saved entire regiments from annihilation, striking fear into enemy psychers and demonic commanders alike. Yet the method of his engagement, swift, brutal, and often leaving lasting scars on the environment and survivors, provoked ethical and strategic debate. Reports filtered back to Terra, describing planetary governors struggling to integrate stories of Spawn into local morale campaigns, unsure whether he was a saintly protector or a merciless arbiter whose presence left as much terror as hope in his wake. On a psychic plane, Spawn's influence was even more pronounced. The warp, a sea of consciousness and emotion, seemed to ripple around him, responding to his movements and intent with a complexity that challenged even the Emperor's subtle awareness. Greater Demons recoiled at the signature of his power, their confidence undermined by a force that did not conform to their understanding of strength and hierarchy. Warp-sensitive beings reported visions of battles yet to come, of destruction and salvation intertwined, as Spawn carved a path through both realms of matter and immaterium. Even astropaths, struggling to communicate across light years, noted subtle disruptions, brief flickers in the Astronomicon, and psychic resonance patterns that suggested Spawn's influence extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, creating consequences that were observed, debated, and carefully analyzed by those devoted to maintaining the Emperor's vision across the galaxy. The Emperor's perception of Spawn was not one of judgment or malice, but measured scrutiny. His subtle psychic echoes seemed to probe Spawn's intentions, weighing the potential for alignment against the risks of unbridled autonomy. The possibility of harnessing his power without compromising the stability of the Imperium became a topic of quiet debate among the most adept and disciplined psychers, who recognized that conventional command structures could not contain such an entity. Every battle Spawn engaged in, Every demonic incursion he countered was catalogued, analyzed, and interpreted through the lens of both strategy and philosophy, seeking to understand whether this warrior of hellish origin might one day serve as an unpredictable agent of the Emperor's will, or remain a solitary force whose very existence posed existential questions. Spawn's presence thus became a focal point for the Imperium's highest minds, a convergence of caution, opportunity, and observation. Psychic impressions of the Emperor lingered around him, subtle and pervasive, a silent acknowledgement that the actions of this hell-spawned warrior could alter the course of wars, the survival of worlds, and the balance of power between the forces of order and chaos. The subtle dance between human observation, imperial strategy, and the inscrutable will of the Emperor highlighted the complex dynamics at play, revealing that in a galaxy perpetually on the brink of annihilation, even the most extraordinary entities must be considered carefully, their motives understood, or at least monitored, with the vigilance only centuries of survival and wisdom can cultivate. Spawn descended into the core of a daemon-infested world with an unflinching resolve. The landscape around him, a warped reflection of nightmares made manifest. Mountains of jagged rock twisted unnaturally, rivers of molten warp energy cutting through valleys like bleeding veins, and the sky above churned with storm clouds laced with psychic distortion. The air was thick with the stench of brimstone and the faint whispers of lost souls, a constant reminder of the horrors that had long claimed dominion over this planet. Spawn's chains rattled in harmony with the twisted rhythms of the world, coiling and lashing in anticipation of the confrontation to come. As he advanced, greater daemons emerged from the fissures of the land, colossal entities of muscle, fire, and shadow, their presence radiating corruption that bent both reality and the minds of mortals nearby. Each movement Spawn made was deliberate, his boots striking scorched earth with a rhythm that resonated across the battlefield, a herald of impending retribution that even the most brazen daemons seemed to recognize. Instinctively, necroplasmic energy flared from his form, casting an eerie green light over the warped terrain, illuminating the twisted faces of demonic entities and the ruins of civilizations that had long since fallen under the sway of chaos. The battlefield, though chaotic in nature, seemed to bend subtly to Spawn's will, debris and terrain shifting to create openings, channels, and vantage points that allowed him to strike with precision beyond mortal comprehension. The initial clash was immediate and brutal. A greater daemon, towering over him with jagged claws and horned visage, lunged with terrifying speed, attempting to rend Spawn with strength born of millennia in the warp. Spawn's chase lashed in response, striking with the velocity of lightning, wrapping around the daemon's limbs and yanking with force sufficient to crack warped armor, and splinter bone. Necroplasm surged outward, searing through demonic flesh and disrupting the very essence of its form, causing it to flicker between states of existence, unstable in a way that defied its centuries of invulnerability. Spawn moved with fluidity, almost dancing through the maelstrom of combat, his chains, cape, and infernal energy acting as extensions of his will, shaping the battlefield and dictating the rhythm of engagement. Lesser daemons swarmed from the edges, attempting to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. But Spawn's movements were preternatural, a symphony of violence where every swing, thrust, and lunge was executed with a calculated precision that left the attacking forces shredded, their bodies reduced to twisted echoes of corrupted flesh. The necroplasmic aura around him seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, each surge destabilizing the warp currents nearby, making coordination and strategy for his foes nearly impossible. As he pressed deeper into the daemon's stronghold, Spawn's awareness extended beyond the immediate physical threats. He sensed the psychic currents of the warp, the intentions and movements of entities both near and distant, anticipating attacks before they occurred. Greater demons that had long ruled with fear and strength found themselves at a disadvantage, their instincts faltering in the presence of a warrior who seemed to exist simultaneously in multiple planes of perception. Spawn exploited this, using the terrain, the warp distortions, and his chains to manipulate engagement, forcing enemies into vulnerable positions while maintaining an aura of unpredictable danger. Each strike carried not only physical devastation, but a psychic weight, inducing terror and confusion that rippled through the enemy ranks, weakening morale and undermining their ability to coordinate attacks. The battlefield became a theater of domination, with Spawn as both conductor and storm, shaping the flow of combat with instincts honed through centuries of violence, vengeance, and survival across realms far removed from mortal comprehension. The clash with a particularly massive daemon tested Spawn's endurance and strategic acumen. The creature towered like a twisted mountain, its body wreathed in infernal fire and clawed with limbs capable of crushing entire squads of Marines. It struck with a force that bent the air itself, each blow sending shockwaves across the warped terrain. Spawn moved fluidly, dodging and weaving, his chains snapping in arcs that dismembered limbs and tore through corrupted flesh. Necroplasm coated the battlefield in an eerie green sheen, reacting to the daemon's presence and destabilizing its form further. The fight became a brutal dance, a clash of wills as much as strength, with Spawn exploiting every opportunity, anticipating attacks, and creating openings that allowed him to dismantle the enemy, piece by piece. Even as fatigue began to touch his form, his focus never wavered, driven by the singular purpose of retribution and the elimination of forces that had terrorized mortal worlds for millennia. Observing from a distance, Imperial psychers and agents of the Inquisition reported disturbances in the warp unlike any previously catalogued. The battle's psychic footprint resonated across space. The interplay of necroplasmic energy, mortal will, and infernal power, creating fluctuations that were unpredictable, dangerous, and yet somehow controlled by Spawn's presence. Reports noted that lesser warp entities were repelled, confused, or destroyed outright, while the most powerful daemons were destabilized, struggling against an opponent whose existence defied their centuries of experience and cunning. The Inquisition's analysts speculated on his potential as both a weapon and a threat, debating the possibility of coordinating future campaigns around his interventions, while acknowledging the inherent unpredictability of a being whose motives were inscrutable and whose power was unmatched. Spawn's advance continued methodically, every step marked by the interplay of strategy, instinct, and overwhelming power. The Greater Daemons that confronted him learned quickly that conventional tactics were futile. Aggression was punished with precision, and hesitation with annihilation. Necroplasmic energy flared with each successful strike, leaving lasting scars upon the battlefield, a green residue that seemed to corrupt the air itself. Shadows twisted and extended under his will, reaching into the folds of the terrain to manipulate, ensnare, and destroy. The larger terrain itself seemed to obey his presence, jagged rocks shifting subtly to provide advantages, fissures opening at critical moments to destabilize enemies, and currents of warp energy bending to his control, creating both a theater of combat and a display of dominance that few could hope to comprehend. Spawn was no mere warrior. He was a force of nature, a singularity of violence and intelligence, moving through the infernal world with the certainty of purpose that both awed and terrified all who observed, mortal or demonic alike. Spawn emerged from the smoldering ruins of a daemon-infested world, his form wreathed in necroplasmic energy that shimmered and coiled like living fire. The battlefield behind him was a testament to his wrath. Shattered armor, scorched earth, and twisted remnants of demonic flesh littered the ground, the air heavy with the scent of brimstone and ozone. Yet, even as he moved forward, his eyes glowed with a purpose that extended beyond mere carnage, scanning the horizon for the next threat, the next force of corruption daring to rise. Imperial forces, weary from endless campaigns, observed from the periphery, both awed and unsettled by the sheer magnitude of his presence. His chains, animated extensions of his will, lashed and coiled in anticipation of foes unseen, reacting to the subtle disturbances in the warp that heralded the approach of malevolent entities. Soldiers whispered in hushed tones, unsure whether to regard him as a savior or a force too uncontrollable to trust. Yet the undeniable truth remained. Where Spawn walked, daemons fell, and chaos retreated, reshaped by the precision and savagery of his interventions. As he traversed the desolate terrain of a strategically vital planetary system, Spawn's presence began to attract the attention of rogue psychers, heretical cults, and minor warp entities who had long preyed upon the weak. These forces, sensing an unprecedented opportunity to challenge a being of immense power, rallied hastily, believing in their collective strength and cunning. Spawn, however, moved with an almost prescient awareness, striking first with devastating precision. Chains whipped through the air, ensnaring limbs, tearing apart daemon forms, and destabilizing psychic defenses before the enemy could even comprehend the magnitude of the threat. Necroplasm surged from his body in controlled bursts, searing flesh and energy alike, leaving lingering trails of green fire that warped the air and disrupted the surrounding psychic currents. Every movement, though swift and violent, carried purpose: to dismantle enemy formations, to prevent greater corruption from taking root, and to leave the battlefield in a state of decisive advantage for the Imperium's forces who dared follow in his wake. Spawn's methods, though undeniably effective, were unconventional, even by the standards of the most battle-hardened Space Marines. His attacks were not merely physical. They carried a psychic resonance that unsettled enemies, instilling fear, confusion, and despair in equal measure. Greater Daemons, accustomed to centuries of dominance, found themselves destabilized, unable to coordinate their attacks, as Spawn exploited both environmental advantages and their own weaknesses. Imperial observers noted the interplay between his infernal energy and the psychic landscape of the battlefield. The necroplasmic aura did not merely burn or sever, it manipulated perception, warping the enemy's understanding of space and timing, creating openings that Spawn exploited with preternatural instinct. Soldiers and commanders alike began to adapt, learning to anticipate his interventions, coordinating their strategies around the destructive symphony he created, all while remaining acutely aware that his loyalty lay only in his own code of vengeance and justice. The psychological impact of Spawn's presence extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Across Imperial worlds, where reports filtered back, civilians and soldiers alike began to perceive him as both a harbinger of hope and an omen of destruction. Stories circulated of a hell-spawned warrior who arrived in moments of direst need, annihilating chaos forces with terrifying efficiency. Only shadows melting into darkness, yet leaving a trail of devastation that served as a reminder of his merciless nature. Priests and local authorities struggled to interpret his interventions. Some preached that he was an instrument of the Emperor's will, a guardian whose actions reflected divine justice. Others warned of the inherent danger in relying on a force so unpredictable, whose methods, though effective, could not be controlled or contained. The mythos of Spawn grew organically, blending factual accounts of his combat prowess with rumor and legend. And across the Imperium, whispers of his deeds spread with both reverence and dread. In his relentless pursuit of corrupted forces, Spawn encountered entire cultist enclaves entrenched in fortified positions, their sorcery fueled by dark pacts and centuries of unchallenged power. These enemies, confident in their mastery of forbidden energies, underestimated the sheer adaptability and cunning of Spawn. Chains erupted from his form with the precision of predatory instinct, seizing and crushing key figures before defensive wards could react. Necroplasm flowed over protective sigils, neutralizing psychic traps and leaving the corrupted elements exposed to his brutal judgment. Every strike was surgical, yet infused with raw power that left a lasting impression upon both the enemy and any witness, human or otherwise. Spawn moved as a singular entity, a combination of hunter, judge, and executioner, his every action simultaneously defensive and offensive, dismantling the enemy's plans with both intellect and infernal force. Observers noted that Spawn's influence extended to shaping broader conflicts, subtly altering the balance of power in contested systems. By eliminating key demonic leaders, disrupting cultist hierarchies, and destabilizing warp currents in critical regions, he created openings for Imperial forces to advance with minimal resistance. Space Marine detachments, once isolated or overextended, found themselves able to reclaim territory previously lost to chaos, guided indirectly by Spawn's interventions. Yet, his presence was not without risk. His merciless approach and the unpredictable nature of his power forced commanders to exercise caution, ensuring that his actions did not inadvertently endanger the very populations they sought to protect. As the campaign progressed, Spawn became both a tactical asset and a symbol, a being whose existence challenged traditional notions of control, loyalty, and strategy within the Imperium. The chaos forces he confronted were forced into retreat, their confidence shattered, their leadership destabilized, and their influence curtailed across multiple sectors. Yet, even as he moved from one battlefield to another, leaving a trail of destruction and salvation, the enigma of his motives remained, a puzzle that the Emperor, the Inquisition, and even the most disciplined Space Marines could not fully decipher. His presence demanded vigilance, respect, and adaptability, a reminder that in a galaxy perpetually under siege by chaos, salvation could arrive in forms both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Spawn advanced into the heart of the largest chaos stronghold the Imperium had ever recorded in the sector. A citadel of warped spires and ever-shifting battlements that clawed at the sky like the talons of some ancient nightmare. The air shimmered with the oppressive weight of warp energy, thick and acrid, carrying the distant screams of tormented souls as they were drawn into the ever-hungry maw of daemonic engines and sorcerous rituals. His chains rattled and coiled in anticipation, each link humming with necroplasmic power, resonating with the malevolent currents that pulsed through the citadel. From the shadows emerged Greater Daemons, colossal manifestations of chaos, whose forms twisted in impossible geometry, their presence radiating an aura of fear that had long been said to crumble the resolve of even the most steadfast warriors. Spawn moved without hesitation, his green glowing eyes fixed, assessing threats and opportunities in the same instant, chains lashing preemptively as if they could sense the intentions of the entities before him. Necroplasm flared across his form, crackling like living fire, casting light and shadow in equal measure across the alien landscape. The intensity of his energy warping the very air and distorting the perceptions of those who dared observe from a distance. The first engagement erupted without warning. A Greater Daemon, lunging from the warped battlements with claws and talons capable of rending reality itself. Spawn reacted with fluid precision, his chains snapping and wrapping around the daemon's limbs, yanking with force enough to splinter bones and destabilize its form within the warp. Necroplasm surged from his body, burning through the daemon's flesh and essence, leaving an echo of its corruption in green-tinted smoldering residue that pulsed briefly before dissipating. Lesser daemons surged from the citadel shadows to support their master, attempting to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. Yet Spawn moved with a preternatural awareness, striking and weaving with lethal efficiency. His chains struck in arcs and coils, severing and ensnaring, while necroplasmic blasts erupted in controlled bursts that disintegrated both physical and psychic defenses. Each movement was purposeful, calculated, and devastating, leaving enemies destabilized and their confidence shattered before they could mount an effective counterattack. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to his will, rocks shifting, fissures opening, and warp energy reacting to his presence, creating both hazards for his enemies and opportunities for him to exploit in the relentless pursuit of annihilation. Spawn's tactical genius extended beyond raw power. He anticipated the movements of his enemies with uncanny accuracy, reading the currents of the warp as though they were an extension of his own senses. Greater daemons that had long dominated such realms found themselves disoriented, unable to predict the next strike, their aggressive patterns disrupted by the precision of his attacks. Necroplasmic energy flared in response to psychic manipulation, countering sorcery with a force that was both physical and metaphysical. The chaos forces accustomed to preying upon mortals and lesser psychers, struggled against a being whose existence defied their comprehension, whose instincts combined infernal experience with a tactical intelligence that exceeded mortal planning. Every engagement reinforced the idea that Spawn was not merely a weapon, but a singularity of influence, reshaping both the battlefield and the psychological landscape of his enemies through sheer force of presence and strategic cunning. Observing the engagement from a distance, Imperial psychers and inquisitorial agents documented the unprecedented effects of Spawn's intervention. Warp currents fluctuated wildly. The Astronomicon flickered in response to his psychic resonance, and localized anomalies destabilized entire sectors of the Citadel's defense systems. It became clear that his influence was not confined to physical destruction alone. The very psychic and metaphysical architecture of the Stronghold was being altered by his actions. Lesser cultists and sorcerers fled in confusion or were annihilated outright, their rituals disrupted, their influence curtailed. Even the greatest demonic entities found themselves forced into retreat or defensive posturing, unable to maintain cohesion under the relentless pressure of Spawn's combination of brute force, strategic insight, and supernatural awareness. Imperial commanders noted with cautious optimism that his interventions created openings previously unimaginable, providing opportunities for their own forces to reclaim territory and strike decisively against entrenched chaos power. Spawn's movements also carried profound psychological effects. Chaos forces, long confident in their dominion, became hesitant, their morale eroded by the realization that conventional power and ancient cunning were insufficient against this singular entity. Imperial troops, by contrast, found inspiration in his presence, rallying where they might have faltered, their resolve strengthened by the demonstration of an almost supernatural force fighting alongside them. The duality of fear and hope created by Spawn's intervention reshaped not only the tactical landscape, but the morale and behavior of every combatant within the theater of war. Civilians who had survived in the shadows of the Citadel whispered of a spectral avenger, one who moved with vengeance incarnate, leaving behind both ruin and liberation in equal measure. As he advanced deeper into the Stronghold, Spawn's interactions with the environment became increasingly dynamic. Chains and necroplasm reshaped the battlefield, toppling corrupted towers, opening fissures in warp-imbued floors, and redirecting currents of destructive energy against enemy positions. The Greater Daemons, realizing the futility of frontal assaults, attempted to coordinate through psychic manipulation and raw power. Yet Spawn anticipated their every move, countering with a combination of reflexive instinct and deliberate strategy. Even the terrain seemed to respond, creaking, shifting, and fracturing in ways that created advantages for him, while ensnaring or destabilizing his foes. The fight became a brutal symphony, a balance of precision, power, and tactical dominance that left no room for error among his enemies, and no doubt regarding the magnitude of his threat. Through his campaign in the Chaos Stronghold, Spawn demonstrated not only destructive capability, but also the ability to reshape engagements across multiple layers of reality. He disrupted leadership hierarchies, destabilized psychic networks, and demolished both corporeal and incorporeal opposition with methodical precision. Each encounter left lingering impressions in the warp, psychic echoes that would ripple outward and influence future conflicts, creating a dynamic where enemy forces had to account not only for the immediate physical threat, but for the broader metaphysical impact of his presence. Imperial strategists and observers alike recognized that Spawn's interventions were unparalleled, blending infernal power, tactical brilliance, and indomitable will in a combination that made him both an asset and a phenomenon whose effects would resonate long after the immediate battlefield had been cleared.